Greetings from the past. The history of every church is a collection of stories because all of us have a story that relates to our place of worship and where we have felt at home. Ligon and I came to Florence in the February, as I remember, of 1956. In 1955, I began to realize that it was time for us to move. We had 2 children, and we were beginning to get a little hungry. So I approached Forrest King, who was called then the state secretary. We now call him a regional minister. And it so happened that Forrest had been my home pastor in Anniston, Alabama. And that was a help. He said, "Don, there are 3 churches open in Kentucky right now. I want you to look at all 3 of them. But I want you to take a second look at the Florence church. I think that church has potential." And so, having made the rounds, I finally, on a December morning of worship at Stamping Ground, where I was serving, as we were singing "We Three Kings of Orient Are," in walks Q.V. Kent, Chester, Edwards, and I've forgotten the third, but 3 elders from this church, as they were singing "We Three Kings of Orient Are." Well, it was no secret that they were what they were and what they were after. But when we arrived here in Florence, we discovered that here was a booming community and a booming church. The little white church that was located on the corner was bursting at the seams. We were having over 200 in worship and chairs in the aisle, and everyone was excited. We needed more space, and we wondered how we were going to do it. You can have a need, but you've got to have a way to pay for it. And that was a little more complicated. I was 2 years out of seminary, and I can't recall that they gave me any instruction in what to do next. I want to put in a sort of an inside that I think has relevance for you and for all churches. The legends that occurred here at Florence Christian in the Little White Church during the dark days of the Great Depression. It is said that Mr. X, who was quite affluent, would come up at the end of the service, would take the offering that was very little, dump it into his pocket, and then pull out his billfold and give to the preacher a $10 bill. Now, he was not cheating because he probably was making up most of it. He was subsidizing the church. It was a way that they survived during a dark and difficult time. There's only one problem. When you have that much affluence, sometimes you have too much influence. And so it was there. We finally reached the day where we had a planning committee, had an architect. We'd gone before the board, we'd gone to the congregation. Everybody had agreed it was time to build. And so we were able to engage a contractor, and we had groundbreaking, and everybody was ready for a new day. It was so cut and dry that Ligon and I decided it's time to take a vacation, so we went to Hagerstown, Maryland, to her home for a visit. When we got back, nothing had happened. And I wondered a while, and I called the contractor and I said, "What's happening? There's nothing going on." He said, "Well, a policeman came up and told me that you didn't have a building permit and I was to stop work." Well, I called the board chairman and we had an emergency meeting that Sunday night. As I recall, there were about 26 of the elders and deacons in a circle there. And the board chair said, folks, we're here for one thing only: decide whether or not we're going to move forward. And so the vote was done verbally, and each one had to vote. So we started at this point and moved around the circle. And he said, we want only one of two kinds of votes, either yay or nay. At the end of the voting, there were 23 yays and 3 nays. Mr. X, who had been responsible for stopping the work, raised his hand, and he said, may I go down and get the building permit for you? Those was the beginning of the building in which your church offices are now held. For us, that was a new day to have that much space. I suggested to the earlier group a town that is booming, as Florence was. They have a lot of needs besides new church buildings. There was no sewer system in Boone County at that time. Again, they hadn't told me in seminary, how do you give a dedication prayer for a sewer system? There was a limited telephone system in Florence at the time. Very few people had phones. I think it took us about 6 weeks to get one after we came to town. I was out calling on the people that were available. It was just amazing, the new people coming in, so you could knock on a lot of doors in an afternoon. And I called on this family, and in the conversation, the lady said, I said something that I had served the church in Stamping Ground, and she said, oh, I knew somebody there, and she said, let me go get a picture. So she went running upstairs, and then, if you've ever heard it's the scariest sound you can, she tripped on the top step, and she came tumbling down the steps. I'd been a Boy Scout, so I knew you're not supposed to move a person like that. They may have broken bones or something. I said, lady, just stay where you are. I'll go get an ambulance. In those days, we didn't have 911. The local funeral director was the one that took care of this. But there was no phone. So I had to jump in the car, go up a mile to a grocery store, call the funeral director, get the thing. Got that settled. The lady was in the ambulance, but we had 2 small children. I didn't know what to do with them. So I put them in the car, and I stopped by the parsonage, and I told Megan, I'll explain to you later, but take care of these 2 kids. Fortunately, the lady was not seriously injured. And you know what? She joined the Baptist church. There are so many stories that I would like to share, but let me share just a couple. The involvement of this church, the laity, as we are on All Saints Day. We had a salty ex-Navy man by the name of Millard Steinhoff. I came into the little white church one morning, and in his crusty way, he said to me, Don, what are you expecting today? And I said, oh, I don't know of anything. He said, let me tell you something. Don't you ever come to church not expecting something to happen. That was a learning for me, but it's a good one. I think all of us should come with the idea that God may have something happening for us to share. So, the needs of a community have been met and are still being met by this church. One of the needs, a member spoke out in a board meeting one night and said, you know, my little girl, she is mentally challenged and there's no help for her. Can't you all do something? And so a committee in those days we had a lot of committees, decided that we would put an ad in the newspaper, we would pass the word around, and over in the little education building, there was a big crowd showed up to discuss what can be done in this community for those who are mentally challenged. And the first thing they realized was that they would need a scholarship to train a teacher to lead in special education. And so they raised the fund for that, and the class began with the Boone County school system. A member of our church who was the parent of a very severely challenged young person came later and said, "Our son didn't make the class. Is there any way we could meet at the church?" And she began a class for seriously challenged children. Some of them had to be carried into the church by hand. And the miracles that happened there. This was a church that was beginning to find that its mission was not only within the church, but outside the church. We hope that as you face a new day, and as you think of the challenges that you have in a different time, but with the same message, that when the opportunity comes for you to step forward, remembering the board meeting that I talked about, that you will be one of the yeas. God bless you.